catch yourself a bat, I suppose. And bats are very like mice, you know. But do cats eat bats?
Hello and welcome to Backstory, the show about books, the craft of writing and the people behind the lines. I'm Mel Cranenburgh. So good to be here with you all today, live and live streaming from Melbourne's RRR in the heady week we all start preparing to emerge from lockdown. A huge thanks to Samira this morning on the score. As always, fantastic music, thought-provoking interviews, the kind of radio you want and you need. You can catch the score each Wednesday from 9 till 12 or streaming on rrr.org.au ever after. Also, many of our shows, including this one, are available as podcasts. So hop on the RRR website for links or just subscribe through your favourite podcatcher. I will be here with you today until 1 p.m. when I hand over to the ever-lovely Beth AQ and the Glass House for more stories about storytellers. Before I start today's show, though, I would like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting today on the lands of the original storytellers of this place, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, here where sovereignty was never ceded. I pay respects to their elders past and present and those of all other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be tuning in today. Today's special edition of Backstory will be live and live streamed across FM, digital, the RRR website and all over the socials. I'll be speaking with much loved and prolific author, poet, essayist, historian and activist Tony Birch. Tony is the award-winning author of, I believe, 9 books, ranging from poetry to short fiction and novels. His best-selling novel, White Girl, won the 2020 New South Wales Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous writing and was shortlisted for the 2020 Miles Franklin Literary Award. Ghost River won the 2016 Victorian Premier's Literary Prize for Indigenous Writing, and Blood was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award in 2012. 5 short story collections under his belt, including Shadowboxing, Father's Day, The Promise, Common People, and his latest collection, Dark as Last Night, which we will be discussing today. In 2017, Tony's contribution to literature was recognised with the Patrick White Award, which is something that really, essentially showcases the enormous contribution that Tony has made over his working life, which should not in any way be, questioned, as it's ranged across so many forms. Just extraordinary influence that Tony's had. I am going to be talking about Dark as Last Night with Tony today. It is his latest book, a collection of short stories that revolve around themes that have long occupied his work: marginalised people in the midst of hardship and poverty, animated with a quietly compelling humanism. A young girl resists the violence of her home life. A brother fights to win back his brother's stolen bike. An old man makes an unlikely connection on his way back to country. And a young woman dances, happy and defiant, in the face of dour disapproval. These stories show the strength and resilience of the people at their heart and beat with a sense of Tony's broader work and activism. So I'm very, very thrilled to introduce Tony Birch, who joins me now to discuss his book, his writing, and the craft behind it. Tony, welcome to Backstory.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really wonderful to be here.
Now, I have so much that I want to talk with you about, but I really do want to start by speaking about this particular short story collection. I am lucky enough to have read quite a bit of your work, and I really felt as though there was an energy in this collection that has lifted it to another level. You've managed to kind of inhabit a lot of very different voices. I feel like some of them are kind of reflective of the bigger works that you've done, whether it be Blood or White Girl. Some of them are kind of an evolution of short story collections like your first, Shadowboxing. Some are actually kind of not just riffing off themes, but maybe even directly related to things that happened or that were sort of sprung out to the world in Whisper Songs, your poetry collection that's also come out this year. So can you talk to me about this collection, what it means for you, and what these stories kind of represent?
Yeah, thank you very much. Look, there were a couple of important issues and themes that came together. I think it's interesting that you talk about the evolution of even going back to a collection like Shadowboxing. So I think that a story in this collection, the Bicycle Thieves story, which I really enjoyed writing, I even called that when I was writing, it's a sort of a shadowboxing story, and it was going back both to location and similar times that I wrote about. And that was clearly because of the story being based on a memory of a shared experience with my younger brother who had passed away before I wrote the story. I think the other issue of influence here is I think that the White Girl was more of a breakthrough for me than I realized. I'd written female voices before, but I think in writing Odette Brown, the Aboriginal matriarch, and her granddaughter Sissy, that had an influence on several stories that I wrote in the collection, which would be The Manger and Flight in particular, which are stories where the protagonists are young girls and very tough, sassy young girls, cheeky. I mean, I love the cheek of the girls in The Manger. And I think that it's reflective of feeling more understanding of those young female characters, which are a bit reflected through experience, having been a dad to now 4 adult girls. I've got a lot of experience with cheeky young women, which is great. But also that I found them doing stuff in the stories that I might have been a bit hesitant to do before. And I mean, I don't mind giving away a slight, like when a girl, to protect her brother, stabs a boy in the thigh with a broken stick. It was just what she had to do. And I don't reckon I would have come up with a different ending pre-White Girl. So there was something about the strength of character. And I suppose the other issue is that you're right about lockdown. There are two stories which are deliberately related to the lockdown experience. One, Blood Bank, a love story, and the other one, Catching a Train with Thelma Plum. And they're both short pieces. I think they're about 2,000 words each. They're both based on observations and experience during lockdown. And I didn't want to make a big lockdown commentary. And I think, by the way, it's interesting where we're going to go with novels that we're thinking about now. So I've been thinking about a contemporary novel at the moment, and I'm thinking, well, should they have masks on? Should they not have masks on? Should I address the issue at all? Or then once you start to address COVID, would it overtake a novel? So all these things are interesting, I think. But those two pieces were cheeky, humorous pieces rather than, I suppose, more, there's very serious issues we know with COVID, but I like the fact that in the Blood Bank's love story, it's based on the fact that I only went to give blood because it was an excuse to get out. I wasn't being, this is part of my civic duty. I just wanted to escape the house. And there's a bit of a play on that in the story of a woman saying to a guy how civic she is, how wonderful she is. She wants self-congratulation. And in the Catching a Train with Thelma Plum, which I also did a poem of, which Thelma Plum really, really enjoyed, was just seeing this young Aboriginal woman, she could have been a Murray woman, in New South Wales, waiting for a train, and the rest of us were all so miserable because it was during lockdown, and she was had her headphones on and was dancing on the platform, then dancing on the train, and for the rest of it was, why is this woman, she can't be doing this, So it was based on that.
Yeah, I love, and I had to look this up again because I wanted to bring it up while you were on the topic of how you've kind of integrated those little bits of what we've just been through in lockdown. There's a descriptor of the narrator in this who's, sitting with everyone else, feeling glum and witnessing this kind of incredibly alive young woman. And you write, I was Mr. Job Seeker Keeper, all hyphenated. And I thought that kind of thing where there is this assumed knowledge or this assumed sort of common experience that you've just worked in there without too much explanation or without overbeating it. And I think that's really how it nicely sits. There is a strange timelessness to the stories that you write. I actually really found myself thinking, when is this? And also that is not as important, because in fact, a lot of the themes you're addressing do have this real sense of a continuity between the timeframes that they all happen in. There's both, in a wonderful sense of this, ongoing resistance of many of the characters to the situations they find themselves in, but also the issues that they face are horrifyingly consistent as well. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, and it is interesting that, in memory and in function, again, if we just mention briefly Bicycle Thieves, it feels like it is. It feels like a late 60s, 70s story. And that's fine, because I'm reflecting back on that time. In the more contemporary stories, and probably the stories which are relative, the two stories strongly relative to my brother's passing, Lemonade and Afterlife, they're very contemporary. With my work, I've had some quite peculiar responses to people trying to date the work with reasons that, to me, I've never understood. Like people say, no one's got a mobile phone in your story, so therefore it's pre-mobile phone. I said, no, I'm not that interested in mobile phones. Or, when you think of a story, I don't think I need to get on the phone, or I don't think my character doesn't need to answer the phone. He's got other things to do. So they do range across those time periods. And I suppose it's about, you have to be a little bit careful. And I'm referencing the same story again. Bicycle Thieves, I'm quite happy to see that. And I don't see nostalgia as a dirty word. Some people do. It's a deliberately nostalgic story about my childhood. It's a deliberate homage, that title, to the great, Italian neo-realist film Bicycle Thieves. Because when I was a kid, if someone said, what's the greatest crime you could ever commit, it would be to steal someone's bike. Because, people had to get to work on their bike. But as in that great movie, people have to make their living. People have to get from A to B so desperately. And I'm not suggesting it's not as drastic now. I love my bike. And, and my brother had his bicycle stolen. So this is what it was based on. So a story like that, I see the time capsule in that. But a lot of the contemporary stories, I think it's, as you alluded to, I don't think I need to reference them in the absolute contemporary for people to understand that these stories could resonate. A story like Afterlife, nominally it could be set in 2020, it could be probably set in 1990, and that doesn't bother me. I don't, when I used to teach creative writing, I used to say to students, you want to create an impression of a period, but you don't need to do product placement like historical fiction.
It's a great way to put it. I thought Bobby Moses was one of those pieces that really defied, you to think about when this is. And I thought that suddenly having a character look at their phone was a really good moment to make a contemporary audience go, these things that this man has to deal with, that Aboriginal people are still facing, that's now. And I felt like that was that kind of challenge was a really interesting part of that story for me. And I'm wondering if that was done deliberately or if that just kind of evolved that way.
Well, and I've done, a lot of my stories are what we might call, when I say place-based, I reference a physical place either deliberately, like the stuff I've done around the river, or the inner city stories. People would think, oh, that probably Fitzroy or Collingwood, which is fine. But what I like about, maybe, and again, it came up certainly right through when I created the fictional town of Dean in The White Girl. But if you go back from my short story collections after shadowboxing, there's often this country town, and the Bobby Moses story is set on the edge of a country town. I've got a story I really like in the province called Colours, which is set in a country town. A couple of others. And what I like about it is these are mythical sort of places that I can't quite pin down, which I like. But the point you make there about Bobby Moses is there's also a strong influence on, and people, I don't think they'd be horrified, but I grew up on popular culture, and I like the notion of the modern Western, as in the importation of the American Western popular culture into Australia. And that story, I saw it in that a modern Western mode of this black man coming along the road and the white copper. And when you imagine the white copper sitting on the side of the road in the police car, it did have more of that sense of that American, memory landscape. And then by bringing them together, the mobile phone was used as a device to show, in a way, the shallowness of the white policeman, not in relationship to himself, but in relationship to his life. He's a country cop. The head cop in town is an arsehole. He's obviously doing, messing up on the side with the guy's wife and stuff. But so his life, in a way, as a policeman, is really hollow and meaningless. I think what essentially I wanted to do in that story, and it might seem surprising, it's too easy for us. One of the things I often say is, as an Aboriginal person, you have to negotiate your life every day in Australia. Sometimes consciously, sometimes not. You have to be strategic. In the workplace, I worked at a liberal-minded university for many years, but I found it a very difficult place to negotiate on a daily basis, just the interaction. You don't know if comments said to you, if you're being paranoid or if people are being deceptive, and it can really mess with your head. So what happens, I think, most Aboriginal people, you have to negotiate your day. And then Bobby Moses meeting this white copper who's sort of already, cynical about his job. I didn't want to create a bad copper, good black fella. The copper's going to run him out of town. On that moment on the highway, how are these two men going to negotiate a shared existence, even if it's for 24 hours? And that, to me, is more the reality of the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in a lot of parts of Australia, particularly big regional towns, where when I was doing the research for The White Girl, you talk to black fellas, and this would have happened in the inner city, not so much now, but when I was a kid, your relationship or your family's relationship with a local policeman was really important to your survival. And by that, I mean that if country towns had a reasonably good copper, or a copper who was too slack to do his job officially, people could live and can live with some sense of autonomy. They can negotiate some freedom historically. And in that moment, I wanted to say, well, these two men, they're finding a way to sort each other out. And I didn't want to turn it into a story of violence or just sort of raw racism, because I think most interactions are much more complex to that and require a lot of savviness and intelligence. And so Bobby Moses, he's playing the copper. He wants that copper to get him out on country. So he knows how to play that relationship.
Yeah, that kind of, he's sort of working out where he can push and where to use that kind of strategic deference, which is, a horrible thing for people to have to learn. But I mean, it's that story is quite emblematic of what you're doing throughout these pieces. It's this kind of, as one critic said, a real Chekhovian sort of tone where there is a quiet realism. Sometimes there's great, acts of violence or big things that are happening. More often, though, the realization is in these everyday kind of occurrences that are kind of moving for their very banality as well. I want to kind of take us from there to come back to, three of the stories that you did talk about. You talked about the bicycle thieves. I want to mention also Lemonade and Afterlife, and these are stories that you've mentioned are based on your own personal loss, your younger brother, and you've kind of really dedicated these stories to him. There is this relationship between brothers that comes out here in this quite beautiful way, in very different ways. Bicycle thieves is sort of something that, again, you could see in terms of brotherly affection and a brother standing up for another brother, but also this idea of being a valiant loser, not fighting a good fight, even if you know that the outcome isn't necessarily going to be winning, I think is a nice sort of metaphor for activism generally, is that you've just got to do the deed to show the resistance. Can you talk a bit about these kind of 3 stories? You did single them out in the acknowledgements to talk about their significance, and I was quite moved by all of those.
Well, I think firstly, the point that you make about quietness is important, so that I do occasionally write about violence more explicitly, but generally because we don't see much violence. Sorry, we don't see the violence that occurs around us. We don't witness most of it. So historically, I've written about domestic violence, and clearly with the title story in this, I have, well, people didn't see it in the street, but everyone knew it was going on. So I feel then to describe it sort of too viscerally or with the lens wouldn't be what I want to do. I want to see how people deal with the lead up and the aftermath. In regard to bicycle thieves, it's a sort of one of those crazy real life things that my younger brother was, and I've said this many times now, but he was such a beautiful looking child. He was angelic. He had these beautiful lush brown curls and big brown eyes, and we always thought he was adopted because the rest of us had really sort of Dickensian rough heads. And he was such a gorgeous child, and he got a dragster bike when he was 10 years of age, and when he was 12 it was stolen. And I at his funeral there was a photograph of him put on those boards, and we were playing music, and it was him the day he got the dragster, and I've never seen him looking happier than that day. He was so happy. And I got obsessed after the funeral about that theft of that bike, which had occurred 45 years earlier. And I asked my mother if she remembered the name of the boy who'd stolen it. And she told me, and I said it to my mum, I'm going to get him. She said, he might be dead, what are you going to do? So, and I was really angry about this childhood kid we knew. And I started saying to her, do you know where that, and I won't say his name, they fell from Collingwood, moved to no one. So I changed my mind, and I went to these remarkable guys who rebuilt vintage bikes, and we found an original dragster frame from the same period, sprayed it pillar box red, and then rebuilt the whole bike, a dragster. And the first Christmas after his death, I rode the bike from my place to my mum's in Collingwood, and everyone in the family had their photograph taken on the bike. So it was just a wonderful way to think about him. And then I thought, no, I want to relive the story because it is such an important story of loss, but also of rejuvenation. So I wrote the story. The other 2 stories are a little different. I loved writing, it might sound odd because it was the saddest moment, but I did love writing Afterlife because it was based on my older and younger sister and myself cleaning out my brother's housing commission flat after he had passed away. And we were arguing because I was trying to say to my sisters, and by the way, his flat was spotless. My mum used to go and clean for him because he had serious psychiatric illness, and it was in good order. We would have left it in good order. My sisters scrubbed it like, trauma cleaners from top to bottom, not because they were traumatized. I said to my sisters, we don't have to do this. And this is the way we have grown up as black fellow working class people. We're clean people because people are always sort of making references to being savage or unwashed or whatever, and we're crazy house cleaners. So they cleaned the house top to bottom, and then we realized when we left there wasn't much of his stuff that we needed, and it was the real life story is like this story. We put a couple of things out in the street. It was on the Housing Commission estate in Collingwood. And someone came really politely, oh, don't you need that? No, we don't need that. And in the end, we said, I'll come in the house. I'm not joking, except for the box that we took with us and my brother's guitar and his jade plant. They cleaned the whole house out. But with real respect, people can come in and grab stuff. And the fact that his possessions were being shared amongst people, the community, that's what led to the story. And then the Lemonade story was really to tell a story about a man's guilt over his brother, which is based on the most minor of incidents. And it's the way that I think our brains work, our emotions work, where I have this terrible guilt over my brother, over just like a childhood thing, and without detail about telling your brother you're going to buy him an ice cream and you nick off for a swim down the river. And when you come back, he's waiting for you. And me feeling obsessed with guilt about it, but someone pointing out to me that in all the photographs at the funeral, how connected we were. So all of those three stories were deliberate ways of recovering that sense of myself in a contemporary self and historically. And I suppose I have to say that I had written what I call a grieving and walking essay for Mianjin, which I begin by a walk I took after his death. I was in Kyoto in Japan, and I begin with thinking about my brother while I'm walking along a canal. And then I clearly, in the poetry collection, there's a section of poems with several poems dedicated to my brother. And I went through that thing. I think, as you would know, a lot of people who have lost family and you think about your work or practice, I felt very uneasy about writing about my brother, but I couldn't stop myself doing it or didn't want to. So I got to a point where I'd written, I think, that first story, and I had to go and talk to my mom and said, look, I've written this stuff and I'm sure there's a lot more to write. I need to know what you think if it's published, because if she said don't do it, I wouldn't do it. But it was I think she was worried that the stories might be gruesome or violent, or that they would be about his illness, which I didn't want to really write about. And she said no, because there was a part of my brother's life that people didn't know about his vibrancy and his beauty. And it was like making sure that people understood this other aspect of his life. And that was really important. And I think now, if I hadn't have written those stories, I don't know where I'd be stuck. And to be brutal, you don't want to turn the loss of a family member into art, but nor do you want to think that it doesn't have enormous value.
Yeah. I'm really keen for you to do a reading from that story, Afterlife, particularly, but I'm feeling as though we may need to take a short sponsorship break shortly, but perhaps when we come back, I would love you to do a reading so people can get a sense of the voice behind all of this. And I do agree with this idea of, you have to be so careful when you're expressing things that are personal to you. But the wonderful thing about filtering things through fiction is it gives you a chance to add that little layer of distance or to make it something that is bigger than simply that story or your grief or your feelings. So you can keep what is yours for you. I think that's really, really beautifully done. So if you have just joined us, you're listening to Backstory or streaming Triple R's Backstory, the show about books, writing and the people behind the lines. I'm Mel Cranenburgh, and today I've been lucky enough to be speaking with Tony Birch, author, historian and activist, about his latest book, a collection of short stories called Dark as Last Night. Tony, I am going to take a little bit of a break to play some sponsorship announcements, but I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation after a short break.
I'm going to grab a quick glass of water.
That's great. You're listening to Backstory on Triple R. I'm Mel Cranenburgh, and on today's special In Conversation, I've been speaking with award-winning author, poet, historian, and activist Tony Birch about his latest book, a collection of short stories, Dark as Last Night. Tony, I'm really hoping that you can do a little bit of a reading for us from one of the stories. I believe you may have one prepared from Afterlife.
Yeah, here's one that I made earlier. It's just a very short, I don't like to read too much. As I explained to Mel, the longer you read, the more mistakes you make. It's just about a page and a half from Afterlife, and it's about a brother and sister, adult, Angie and Joe, who go to clean the government flat where their brother had passed away a week earlier, and the older brother had found his brother in the house, and Angie, the younger sister, makes a demand of him. And when I say younger, they're both adults, in probably early 40s. Angie finds the mugs with hot water and milk and nods in the direction of Billy's bedroom. Before we start, you have to show me where you found him. I could hardly believe what she'd said. What do you mean? I need to see where he was in the bedroom when you found him. She walked into Billy's room. I refused to follow her. I'm not doing it, Angie, I can't. She turned around, came back to where I was standing and took hold of my hand. Burying her face in my woolen jumper, she whispered almost inaudibly, I'm sorry. I'd always melted when my younger sister really needed me. I placed a hand gently on the back of her head and said, sorry for what? You've done nothing wrong. But I did, Joe. I made certain that you would be the one to find him. I was too afraid to come over here. But you couldn't have. I did, Joe. I took the call from his nurse, Paul. He told me that he'd found Billy unresponsive. He didn't say he was dead, but I knew. Straight away I knew. I didn't have the courage to be with my own brother. She began to sob and grip my hand tighter. That's why I called you, Joe. I couldn't do it. I'm so sorry. Together we went into Billy's bedroom. The mattress had been stripped. Taking a deep breath, I pointed to the floor at the end of the bed. The dark blood stain in the carpet was obvious. Here, I found him lying here. Angie wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her jumper. Where exactly, she asked. Well, his feet were at the corner of the bed and he was lying on his side. Angie lay down on the floor and turned on her side. Like this? What are you do? Why are you doing this, Angie? Like this, she repeated insistently. Yeah, like that. Lying on her side, Angie opened her hand and lightly clawed at the carpet with her fingertips. She then curled her body into a ball and closed her eyes. I sat on the bed and breathed in and out quietly in unison with my sister. She eventually got up from the floor, sat next to me and draped an arm over my shoulder, and neither of us spoke.
Thank you for that. That's from Tony Birch's collection, Dark as Last Night, a story, excuse me, called Afterlife. I want to talk to you about the art of writing short stories. You are an enormously generous speaker and writer in that you are, obviously you've shared your talents as a creative writing lecturer. You've spoken a great deal about the art of writing. And I found a really quite lovely discussion that you wrote, I believe, for the ABC about, you know, some advice for emerging writers. You acknowledge that it is indeed fraught to offer advice to people who may have very different styles and needs. But I thought your writing, you know, I guess the advice that you gave, it's both enormously practical, but also things that people don't get told perhaps enough. You say, just to précis, you firstly, an important thing to have is curiosity. The next thing is a good work ethic and some great writing habits. And finally, and I'll read this one out, the real reward comes when the writing is difficult. When you realize that for the writing to be at its best, for the story to work, you need to struggle to find the right word to shape the sentence to produce an engaging portrait of a character. I'd love to kind of explore each of these areas. Firstly, the idea of curiosity. Why can you talk a bit about that in your writing experience?
Yeah, and I suppose just to preface it, and I don't want to go over this in long detail. Yeah, people have argued about can creative writing be taught, and I know a couple of writers who say it can't be taught. You have to be a natural, and I also know that those people are very bad writing teachers, um, quite personally. Um, and I think anything can be taught, and that might seem odd. I don't mean it can be taught. Like, I love photography and I love music, but I'm never going to be a good musician. I'm never going to be a great photographer. So I'm not saying we can all achieve excellence. But what I strongly believe is that the real role of a creative writing teacher or creative teacher is to try and create an energetic atmosphere, an environment, studio, which allows people to flourish and attain the best standard they can. And that's the real point. So that I I could start off with a class of 10 young students, and they all have, yes, natural levels of creativity or talent. Yeah, and I remember Raymond Carver, a great quote, he said, talent's nothing. Probably over exaggerated, but it's not everything. And you can be in a room with 10 people. And I taught creative writing for a long time now. And particularly there'd always be a couple of young women who were quiet and they wouldn't say much, but you just, there's something you knew, you thought this person, they've got it in here. And their first writings might be a bit hesitant, usually quite humble, but they stay with it. And Alice Bishop, who's a great short story writer, I taught Alice, and I don't take credit for teaching her, but what I would take credit for, we created an environment that allowed Alice to become confident in her work. And my sense of being creative writing, that's what you are doing. You're there to give people confidence. You're there to help them grow. And then in relationship to curiosity, I think some of us are more innately curious than others. I believe that. Some of us have innate observational skills that others don't, or they haven't exercised, I think would be best to say. So the point about observation and curiosity, again, what I think is it can be encouraged, developed, nurtured, and grown. So again, you can give people really practical skills as a teacher that says, I firmly believe, for me as a short story writer, I could look at this collection and in almost every story, you could say, if Mel, you could say, well, where's the seed of that story? Where's the moment that trigger went? I could point to the finished scene or moment. And what it is you become curious about something you have observed and you start to know there's something more here. There's something more here to work with. And I used to do the most basic exercise, which if people say to me, what would you do to start people doing writing or to exercise their writing habit? It's the sketch, the written sketch. Mm. I know I was watching a thing online the other day with Stephen King, and he says never use a notebook. See, and this is why the problem is giving advice. I say always have a notebook, but I'll defer to Stephen King, I suppose. But to take your notebook, to sit in a park, to sit on a tram, to sit in a cafe, you see someone across the cafe and you do a written sketch, and it's not photographic, but it might be impressionistic of their habits or something. What you're doing there is you're developing ability to firstly be three-dimensional, and then secondly you start to compose characteristics onto that sketch. So
an interesting thing to talk about in light of the discussion around who is the bad art friend, that this idea of like basing something on something you've taken from life is really at the core of most short story writing.
And you were spot on before. It's that you're not trying to produce real life. And I mean, I get very good reviews. When occasionally people talk about me as a social realist, it's such a lazy, dated term. Yeah, this is usually coming from people who are middle class English students who were still referring to Marx. So that, of course, a lot of what I think about is based on realism. And then the fact is, fiction gives you the freedom to take it wherever you like. So that exercising as a writer, I think, is really important. So that in the way, the observational skill. The second one of work habit, to me, is the key. And again, I drum this into my students, and I would say the students, I've seen students, in recent years publishing and doing stuff, and they're the students that understood or developed their own work ethic. And work ethic is simple. I say, know when you write best, know how you write best. Are you a morning writer, afternoon writer, all day writer? But know when you get value and productivity. I mean, it is labor, it's work. So when a student would say, I sat at the screen all day, nothing happened, I'd say, well, get away from the screen, go for a walk. If a student said, oh, I can't do what you're suggesting, 2 hours a day, 3 times a week, I'm going to cram and do a story next week. And you know that's never going to happen. And I used to say to people, I know how busy everyone is, like we are all busy people. If you want to write, you've got to have, and I call it gentle selfishness. Even if you could only put aside 2 hours a week, 3 times a week, whether you had to get up earlier in the morning or later at night, that's 6 hours. If you stick to that, you will write, you will produce writing.
Such an interesting one, isn't it? And you mentioned this as well, that for you, you've observed being a teacher, many students who show great talent, but who don't have that stickability. They don't have the attrition of just a daily habit or of putting aside time for writing, that the people who really become the successful writer or even just make a living out of writing are the ones who just do it.
Yeah.
That bump to the seat, I think.
And I'm very pragmatic. There are various, there's so many barricades that stop it. And that can be, really, they can vary from money. I know people would love to write, but they just can't afford to. They're working in, imagine if someone's working a full-time job and it's a very tiring job and they want to be a writer. I've just had mouth surgery in the last week, and the guy who did the surgery, he's an Iraqi, originally a refugee guy, lovely fellow. And we've been talking about writing short stories every time I've been to his office. And he would love to write short stories, but his job is exhausting. And so I understand those impracticalities. I understand the shocking barriers in the place of, that have been historically been in the place of women, in the place of First Nations writers. I've experienced some of that, but I've also been much luckier than people. But what I say to people is it's something you don't want to, in 10 years, 20 years, saying, I wished I could have done that. So even I do try and encourage people. I know that you have limitations. I know that there are restrictions in place, but try and find that place to let yourself do it. And I was sort of lucky by accident. I hadn't written any fiction until I didn't publish Shadowbox until I was 49. And when my first 3 kids were born, I used to do like the middle of the night feed. And if I fed one of the kids at about 4 o'clock in the morning, going back to bed after I put the kids back was useless. And I actually found that early morning period of about 4:30 to 6:30 or 7, I came to love that. And I'm actually very productive early morning. Like I can't do anything after lunch.
You're like a crepuscular creature.
So it's to say, okay, this is how it works. And I reckon I've always worked full time until last year with my writing, and I've had to negotiate it around other things, but I accept that. And I think that for most writers, when people say, if you want to be a writer, make sure you've got a job, as in not a writing job, because I think for most of us, if you're worrying about money all the time, if you can't do other things with your life, it can be its own misery. And I think that, when I hear writers who are able to write full time, and usually it's with the support of another person, and often those supporters are women who are working, this sounds a bit harsh. I don't think that's fair.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I don't like my sense is, in a family, an extended Aboriginal family environment, I've got to contribute right across the spectrum of my extended family's life, so that my writing, as much as I love it, it's not the most important thing to me. And if my other family situation wasn't in balance, I wouldn't be able to write.
Having something else as well in your life saves you from that that trope of self-cannibalizing your writing life in what becomes this kind of meta self-reflexive thing that a lot of writers end up doing. I want to talk about the last part of your advice, which is the real reward comes when the writing is difficult. Can you speak to that part?
Yeah, I mean, and that's I actually don't think that's complicated for me, and it probably comes out of, and a lot of people don't know this. I I went to the university in 1988 when I was 30, and a lot of my publishing in the 90s and early 2000s would be in, contesting colonial history and political activism stuff. But before that, I had been a poet with the 9 to 5 collective with people like Pio and Yachi Fanoy, and a group of anarchists in the early 80s. So I was writing some good and some really bad poetry. You've got to be able to write some bad poetry if you're ever going to write any good poetry. And I think as a poet, one of the things as a poet is for me, I'm always frustrated. I'll never quite find the line that I want. So, the note that you really want, you just don't quite hit it. And that's part of the life, I think, for a lot of poets. What I learned from that and what I've taken to my fiction, there is a moment when you're writing, Mel, and where it be a scene of dialogue, or often in description, I think, where you don't want to overload the page and you just want to have enough of an impression towards the reader through the rest. And you realize you're not doing it well enough. And then there's this really moment where you go, oh, it'll be good enough. Oh, I can't be bothered. That's just going to have to be, well, it's not your laundry list, That's when I walk away from the computer because I think I'm tired or I'm not mentally attuned. So knowing that difficult was also saying, well, today is not a good day to write, to walk away and then go back to it fresh in the morning, and you'll find yourself rejuvenated. And I'll say this because if anyone that I ever taught is listening, they'll go, if he ever mentions running again, I've been a runner for 40 years. And it's that thing when you hit the hill and this is the hard bit and I'm not going to stop, because to stop halfway up a hill is, for a runner, is really humiliating. So it's about knowing when to stop and when to go, and don't take shortcuts. You can't, because when you take a shortcut and you're writing, and occasionally I'm sure I've done, I'm sure I've done it. When you pick up the piece of writing when it's published, you just think that's a lazy outcome. And the reader may not know it, but you know it. And you're the first person to know when you're writing badly, and it's a terrible feeling.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting way that you've characterized all of this, because I think quite often people, sort of interested in the inspiration for stories, or they're interested in, how you craft your sentences. But this idea of these very fundamentally practical elements to writing, that writing is essentially labor. And I think that is something you outright say. You're not elevating it to some, lofty thing. It is a piece of work that someone has done, that they poured themselves into. There is that transformative or transcendent element to it, though, as well. Where do you feel like that comes from for you?
I have a lovely friend, Damien Wright, who's a wonderful furniture maker, and a great furniture maker. He's made a couple of tables for me, and he's going to make me a new writing desk, I think. We've talked about this, just on the work basis, we believe this in the same way, that he's always said, imagine if, he makes chairs as well. He said, imagine if I made a table and a chair and no one ever sat at it. It'd be a terrible feeling. You're doing the work. So it's me saying, I write a short story, no one ever read it. The work is unread. The table is never sat at. The relationship between the reader and the writer, or the person who buys or sits at the chair, it's in what happens to that chair and table in that story. And that's where, if your work was ever able to be considered art, it's the reader who makes that decision, not you. It's I think my friend's furniture work is art, but he wouldn't make that decision because he's doing the work. So I think that the transcendence is really done by the reader. And I've always said, and I'm not being overly humble, it's just the emotional feeling you get. When I try to talk to people about the value of being a writer, you can sell, and my books sell reasonably well. I've done well. I get really well. I've been very lucky. But sometimes what matters is sitting in a room with readers, like at a book club or at a library, and then talking about your work, and then having revealed what you didn't know, or as you said, transcending or taking the work to a level that you didn't quite understand. because that generosity you get from readers is probably, it's everything. I mean, and I've only ever had one moment where I felt like I'd been stabbed through the heart by Ralph Epstein on the ABC. A woman was reviewing The White Girl and talked about how much she loved it, and he just said, "Oh, I couldn't even finish it. It was so boring." It was a real, and it wasn't. It's hard to explain to someone because that could sound like me being egotistical or sensitive. It was like it killed the joy of having done something. I mean, my mother rang the radio station to give me.
I love that.
Yeah, I know. If it was my mother, I would say that's him for up Smith Street or something. She's on one of those motor scooters. Yeah, she'll
Just
run
made a
him
big
over.
mistake.
Yeah. So, and that's. I mean, this is the other thing about being a writer is that understand that the real joy is not owning the work. And I know this sounds like a cliche. It's putting it out there, and people are reading it. You don't know where they're reading it. You don't know how they're reading it. There's people in bed reading it, people on a tram. I know someone told me they saw a poem of mine stuck to a fridge at a party, at a student party in Carlton, as you would have done way back. So and I said, I don't want to know what happened next. The fact that it was on the door of the fridge and people were opening the fridge and getting a drink and then closing the fridge and seeing the poem there. It's the unknown of that I really like, because it's the poem or the story or the book, it has its own life.
Yeah, I love that. This kind of other life of, the interpretation where it flies to. Before we finish up, and we are coming very close to the end of this interview, which has gone so quickly, I would like to talk about the titular story, Dark as Last Night. The stories that bookend this collection are Dark as Last Night and the Riding the Train with Thelma Plum, I think it's called. Riding Trains with Thelma Plum. They're both really strong female kind of characters within those stories. Where did I think you have spoken about where Dark as Last Night as a name came from, but why did you decide to name the whole collection this, and what was the resonance from that first story?
Well, the first story, I do have to pay respect. The woman who edited my poetry collection, Anita Few, she's a poet. She works at Red Room Poetry in Sydney, a great organisation. She sent me a poem when we were working on my collection, and there was something in that poem, the mood of it, that just seemed to strike a chord with what I was trying to do. And I was writing that front story, and I asked her eventually, could I use the title on the story and then the title for the book, and she was so generous in allowing me to do that. The story, though, it is again possibly like a reversion to thinking about my first book, Shadowboxing, which a lot of it was about violence. But I have to say quite honestly that I think that, like everyone, I've been really impacted by the rise of voices amongst women in the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement in the last several years around male violence, rape culture, and that I didn't want to make a sort of and I say this quite honestly, a male sort of entry into that. I wanted to remember my childhood and the tenacity of my older sister in particular in confronting violence in our family home. And also then to bring this sort of almost mystical folkloric sort of character, Little Red, into the story, who is she's a wonderful character because she's alien herself. She's from Europe, a post-war refugee. She can't understand how this culture operates. And just in that, there's a beautiful relationship with her and the girl. Also, one of the reviewers, and I won't give away the ending to the story, but I love the way he did describe it. And I hadn't thought about this, Mel, beforehand, as wish fulfillment. So I think when you grow up in a house where men treat children and women so badly, you have all sorts of fantasies about what you want to happen, and then they don't happen. And I didn't realize until I read that this was my fantasy revenge. And that's fine, because I'm like anyone else, I'm a survivor of terrible domestic violence. And it's a story where you're allowed to have a win. You're allowed to get value. And then thinking about the Riding Trains with Thelma Plum, I'm not sure how we thought about that being the last piece, But yeah, here's a young Aboriginal woman in a hoodie with the flag, and just to be honest, say, buggy you, I'm gonna be out here. And it was again a humorous story because I take the piss out of poets a little bit in the story. The couple with their moleskin notebooks.
Taking the piss out of yourself a little bit as well, Tony, as a
Well,
poet.
I did.
Think
I
you're
did.
allowed.
Exactly, was taking the piss out of myself because my character in that was just as miserable as everyone else. And you know, just to finish, I wanted it in that story to say there's these three worlds. There are the poor people during total lockdown who've got to go and wipe the asses of everyone else and keep us going. There are other people like I was really doing, luxuriating at home in my Muji pajamas and a cup of Milo, like I didn't have to do anything. Yeah, I was. And then there's this woman who's the only really vibrant character in this moment. And I think I see it as both a story of hope, but also I had this sort of amalgam of images of, I've been doing a lot of work with younger Aboriginal women and interviewing young poets like Evelyn Araluen, Jazz Money, who have both put out collections this year. And I love these young black fuller women. They're just so tenacious. And
yeah,
it captures that as well.
Such a great note to leave it on, Tony. I could genuinely listen to you talk all day, but we have no time left, unfortunately. Thank you so much for joining me today on Backstory to talk about your wonderful collection of short stories, Dark as Last Night.
Oh, really, thanks for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
You've been listening to Tony Birch live in conversation on Backstory. Tony's book, Dark as Last Night, is out now. And a big thank you to everyone who's been listening or been watching via FM Digital Triple R's website and on socials, especially our Triple R subscribers whose support is essential to keep us doing what we do. We wouldn't be here without you, obviously. And a huge thank you to our In Conversation sponsors, Thermalwood, providing energy-efficient retrofit double glazing solutions for timber windows. Thank you, Thermalwood, for making this live stream possible. If you miss this In Conversation, you can listen back or watch on rrr.org.au. I will, of course, be back again next week live. Up next is Beth AQ on the Glass House with more stories about storytellers. I'm going to take you out on a little bit of a track. Baker Boy, funk with us. You're listening to Triple R. Stay